You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I'm glad that you've joined me again. I just want to remind you that if you want to support this series, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net and click the donation button. This week's reading is actually a very short one. It's only about 10 verses long. And really, in truth, I was trying to find an interesting theme for this one. But unfortunately, when you have something this short, it gets a little difficult. Now, there are some interesting parallels between our reading, current reading, and other parts of the Tanakh. However, the message itself continues to be the message that we've seen so far. And this requires some flexibility with the series, which requires me to kind of go into maybe some other subjects. And in truth, I kind of sat down to think about the fact that I've never really discussed openly the origins of the Haftarah. First of all, what exactly is a Haftarah? What Haftarah really comes from what patal, to end something, to finish something and to say goodbye, more or less. And very commonly, when people explain the origins of the Haftarah, usually you hear the explanation something about the Romans or maybe the Hellenes who forced the Jews living in the land of Israel not to read from the Torah anymore, and basically caused everyone to move away for at least a while from reading the Torah. But to supplement the service in the synagogue, presumably, again, when exactly is the service of the synagogue that we see today started is a really, really good question. But if we say it's Roman times, then we already know that the services they had back then were very similar to the services we have today. However, the practice itself, we don't really know exactly when it started, which means that there are a lot of speculations about the subject. Now, back in the 70s, specifically 1978, a researcher called Shmuel Hakohen Vengiltan went through a lot of details regarding the origins of the Haftarah, and he actually concludes something very, very different. So he goes through the theory of the Haftarah, starting off with the origins of, say, a prohibition of reading the Torah. So he mostly talks about the idea that maybe during the period of the Hasmoneans, or actually before the Hasmoneans, just before the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE, obviously, they decided that the Jews were not allowed to read anymore from the Torah as part of the attack on Torah keeping overall. And they gave this, one of the decrees was that no one was allowed to read publicly in the Torah. Now, what does it mean publicly? Is it versus privately? Maybe it does mean versus privately, because we are talking about more of a cultural struggle that was out in the open, out in the public. So maybe if you were indoors, you were allowed to read. There's a very good question about that. Though some midrashim kind of go into the direction that they even intrude into people's houses and checked if they're reading from the Torah. But that might be a bit of an extension of something else. Midrashim are a very, very difficult thing. And he actually rejects this. He says that there's really no evidence whatsoever. He actually gives probably dozens of sources that discuss the idea, but all of these sources are very, very late, which means that none of them really have any historical credence, and we're only looking at something that's mostly theoretical and probably not real. So he actually rejects this. And he goes into an entire discussion that has, again, maybe a little bit of conjecture by him, but he does conclude that there is some kind of a connection between the word Haftarah and where the origins of the practice came. And he says the word Haftarah can come from the idea of concluding or ending the Torah reading. So you are kind of like saying goodbye to the Torah reading, which was a very, very central part of the synagogue practice, because the tradition was that the public reading of the Torah came much, much earlier. Even some push it to the idea that because we see a public reading of the Torah during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, specifically Ezra reading out in public on the podium, that Ezra was the one who promoted the idea of reading Torah in public and actually made a takana, basically a decree by his authority as a religious figure. And there's a whole history about what exactly was the authority of Ezra, and maybe eventually I'll get around to translating one of the papers I wrote about this period and go into the subject of who exactly Ezra was, what do we know about him, what exactly is some of the terminology used about him that give him this authority. So he was basically a religious authority by the decree of the Persian Empire, and one of his authorities was to be in charge of the religion, which meant that he technically had political power or local political power that enabled him to make decisions. And one of the traditions is that the decision that he made was that you have to read the Torah publicly every Monday and Thursday. So apparently reading from the Torah on Shabbat was something Moses presumably made a decree. Again, these are still a lot of conjectures, but the public reading of Torah was something very, very, very old. We don't know exactly how old, but it was there prior to this period. Now, what it meant was that they did read in public, but they would sometimes do something after it. What he actually concludes is that the origins of the Haftarah was really in the sermon that the rabbi or the teacher, the sofer, if we're talking about the period of the Hasmoneans, would actually say after the Torah reading, which means that really what we're talking about is they were reading in public, and then the teacher, whatever teacher they were, would stand or sit, depends. Sometimes they actually had a chair, the chair of Moses, or Cathédrale de Moshe is one of them that was actually discovered with an inscription that says that this is the throne of Moses. And they would give a teaching which usually connected to the Torah reading itself. They'll pick a verse. This is the early versions of the Midrash. This was a public speech where they'll actually do exegesis and read verses, or maybe out of memory, probably mostly out of memory. The Torah scrolls were usually kept in a separate room, and they wouldn't sit there with a Torah scroll in their lap or something. So they would actually remember verses and connect their discussion, their exegesis or whatever, to the reading that they had at the time, and in many cases also lead into something that was going on there during their time, very similar to sometimes things that I personally do, where I talk about something that's going on right now in our times, and I relate it somehow to the Bible. And this was probably the original Haftarah. This is what he concludes. Now, the transition from that type of Haftarah to the Haftarah we do today, which is the reading from the prophets, and only from the prophets, it's really interesting. Though I did meet, many years ago, a person who was doing some studies on the traditions of the land of Israel, and he claimed that there was, during the afternoon prayers of Shabbat, that they would read from the Torah, and then they would read actually from the writings and not from the prophets. I don't know much about the research done on this, but I actually heard the conclusion from him, and this is actually a person I trust greatly on the subjects of what were the practices in the land of Israel during the Roman and Byzantine era. But in any case, the Haftarah was basically transformed into the public reading of the prophets, but there's a question, why move from this to that? Or in truth, it would actually should say, why add reading from the prophets and the drasha, basically the discussion the rabbi or the teacher has, was said at the end. So usually it changed. They used to do Torah reading, speech from the rabbi or teacher, and then everyone goes home. This was moved to Torah reading, prophet reading, maybe some other prayers, and then the talk at the end of everything. Today, for example, I've been in synagogues where the talk is placed between the prayers and the Torah reading. It's very, very common here in Israel. I don't know what's the practice in the United States. I think it's the same thing. But in any case, what we actually have here is a transition. He asks the question, why do we have this transition? So he goes into a really, really interesting idea. And the idea he presents is that this was actually a polemic against the Samaritans. Now, for those who don't know who Samaritans are, the Samaritans are a group of Torah-keeping people that, according to the Book of Kings, were brought from we'll call the northeast part of Mesopotamia. They were brought over here, placed in Samaria, and then they basically eventually took upon themselves the faith of Israel. Now, if we actually look at more details about this subject, the Samaritans were really a mixture of several things. We do know that the Assyrians would exile people from place to place, and we know as a fact that they did place people here as well. However, the land wasn't empty. It's been proven multiple times, and you can even see it in the Tanakh itself. The land wasn't really empty. The Assyrians tended to exile only people that it was worthwhile taking, so they can put them in their own places and develop these underdeveloped areas in the empire. So they move people around depending on what they need. And we even find the Babylonians doing the exact same thing. If we look at the end of the Book of Kings, it describes a very similar practice. They only exile people from here worthwhile, all the wealthy, important people, and they leave the commoners to work the land. Now, the Assyrians, the difference between the Assyrians and Babylonians was that the Assyrians did a two-sided exile, which means that they would take people from one place, put them somewhere else, and so on. It's to break up people's connection to their land, to basically take away hope. The Assyrians understood the idea of psychological warfare very, very well. There were some really horrendous things that they did. For example, they would crucify people. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion. Crucifixion was in the East even before the Romans showed up. And they would also exile people and place them somewhere else to take away any possible hope that they would have. The Babylonians didn't do the same thing. What they did was they exile people, but they wouldn't bring people back. They wouldn't take people from one place and move them there. The whole idea of moving people from place to place and filling gaps was that you can't go back there. There's someone else living there now. So if you ever have the hope of going back there, you're going to be confronted by people who are already living there and will probably try to protect whatever property they've been given. But in any case, the north wasn't completely empty. There were even people who fled down south to Judea, maybe when the Assyrian threat vanished, when there was actually a vacuum for a while, they might have gone back up. And also Josephus describes groups from Judea also joined the Assyrians. For example, the son of the high priest, I can't remember if it was Yadua II or Yadua III, his son married the daughter of Sanballat, who was the local chieftain placed there by the Persians, or originally by the Assyrians, and the Babylonians, and then eventually the Persians. There's actually a very long list of several Sanballats. One of them is also mentioned in the book of Nehemiah as one of Nehemiah's enemies. So there was actually a mixture. And the Samaritans to this very day are technically a mixture, though there are only several hundred of them left. They were massacred by the Turks. It's a very, very long story. There was a point where we know that there was about 1.5 million Samaritans. There's almost nothing left of them. They dwindled. But there were massacres done against them, which is really, really sad. But in any case, the Samaritans, the story with them is they only have the Torah. The Samaritans have these Torah scrolls that they write in their own version of Paleo-Hebrew. If you actually study the way the Paleo-Hebrew is written, you actually see that it connects to around the period of the second century BCE. That's the style of calligraphy they more or less froze, and we have evidence of this, which means that's probably around the time when they separated from the Judeans, basically from the Jews, and really became the Samaritans that we know today. Or even earlier than that, we're talking about, even in the Roman era and even before the Roman era, we already know that they were separated from one another, but a lot of the stories go on during the Roman era because the Samaritans were trying to get some protection and some basically, probably some, advantages over the Judeans by claiming that they're not connected to the Judeans. It's a whole political story. to this very day, there's some animosity. I've sat with Samaritans. They have some weird ideas about Jews. Jews have some weird ideas about Samaritans. At the end of the day, we're technically all brothers, in truth. The problem is that we can't know who's the descendant of whom and so on. Some of them might be descendants of one group, others descendants of Israelites. It's a long story. But in any case, the thing about the Samaritans is that they reject the Bible. They only accept the Torah, and they only accept their version of the Torah. Now, if you ever study the Samaritan version of the Torah, you'll see a lot of interesting changes, especially emphasizing the idea of worship at Mount Gerizim. They reject all the words of the prophets. I actually once asked, do you believe there were prophets after Moses? And I think their tendency is to say that they believe that there probably were different leaders, but no one was really a full-fledged prophet, which is a complete contradiction of reality when it comes to what we know about the period. But the Samaritans have their own version of history, and this is basically what they follow. Now, the thing is that they rejected the prophets and the writings. Now, around this time, and this is usually how academics look at it, the final form of the prophets was solidified, because you have to remember some of the prophets were written after the destruction. Like, for example, Jeremiah records things after the destruction. They could even argue, we have the whole discussion about Isaiah. All Isaiah completely from Isaiah, the Isaiah of the time of King Hezekiah. Is it possible that other pieces there? In any case, we also have prophets like Malachi, Haggai, and so on. These were prophets who lived at a time that where the Samaritans, or the people who were connected to the early version of the Samaritans, and the Judeans already had some struggles between them. You have to remember Haggai and Zechariah were both emphasizing the principle of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was struggling with people from the north as well. So it's quite possible that the Samaritans always had this memory that the prophets, and by saying prophets, not just the prophets that they knew of at the time, but also anyone who was identified as a prophet, especially by Judeans, all belonged to the same school, the same line of thought, and therefore we have to reject anything that they say. It's my conjecture. It's an idea. I don't know if I can ever prove this. I have studied some Samaritan history. I've specifically studied this period. I know that Haggai and other prophets were very instrumental in the construction of the Second Temple, and the Second Temple was also a place where they were rejected. The Samaritans were rejected by the Judeans, specifically by Ezra and Nehemiah, and the group of holiness in Jerusalem. And what it probably created is an animosity throughout time, but for the books to really become the books that we know today, it took a little bit more time. But we know that from a speech by Judah the Maccabee, which was recorded, I think, in 2nd Maccabees, it mentions that he talks about the Torah and the prophets. It doesn't mention the writings. So this has led some scholars to the idea that maybe the writings were still fluid, and there actually is an introduction to the book of Ben Sirah, which is another type of Proverbs type of book, that indicates that there was still some fluidity at the time. And he says, I'm not writing this to replace, I'm writing this to add. So it's quite possible they were allowed to add books, which explains why we have all the Dead Sea Scrolls and items of that sort, and why people can consider them holy, even though we know that many of these books, like the Sons of Light versus the Sons of Darkness, we have the Temple Scroll, we have different commentaries in the Peshel and so on. Why could they allow these books to be holy? The answer is very, very simple, because they still believe in a certain level of fluidity in the text itself. The final stamp on the Bible saying this is the Bible and that's it comes a little bit later, and especially, for example, in Christianity, even the fluidity is even greater, because Christianity said, well, it doesn't end here, and this is why, for example, in many Christian Bibles, it goes, the prophets are really pushed towards the end. In Judaism, it's the other way around. The prophets are in the middle, writings are at the end. The prophets are pushed at the end. This is from my own professor, Dr. Cynthia Edinburgh. I asked about this, and she said it's because Christianity wants to perceive that the New Testament is a continuation of the prophecies of prophecy, and overall prophecy never really ended. It continued through the people of the New Testament, and this is why many Christian Bibles are designed this way. What is concluded by Winkelton is that he actually says that it was a polemic against the Samaritans. Because the Samaritans rejected the idea of the books of prophecy being part of the Holy Scripture, it was added to the public prayer. How do you demonstrate that something is or isn't important? You do a public demonstration of this, which means you do something that binds everyone in an agreed way, and it's done publicly in a ceremonial way that indicates this is what we want something to be. So he concludes that the reason we actually have haftarot is because, or haftarot specifically from the prophets, is because of that specific argument. But by the time, and this is my assumption, by the time that we finish closing the writings, there was no public need to add the writings. First of all, we do read some of the writings in public, like the Book of Esther, though in the Second Temple there's some interesting questions, but we do read Kohelet, we do read Shir HaShirim, or Song of Songs, we do read Ecclesiastes in public, so there are some elements that didn't require doing something as drastic as this, is changing the structure of services to add the prophets. So he says it was basically a polemic against the Samaritans by publicly reading from the prophets, which is something the Samaritans rejected. So this is a really interesting direction. I actually never heard this one before. While I was researching this subject, I came across this paper, very, very well written, very long as well, very surprisingly long, and with a lot of very, very interesting sources. The only thing was that he had great difficulty finding anything historical, like historical writings or inscriptions or something. He really had to base himself on looking in between statements and in between ideas, and then by that concluding what historically happened, which is always very, very difficult if you don't have an historical source. And as a trained historian, I know this very, very well, where I was given a text and said, okay, figure out what happened here historically without reading anything else. And it was difficult. It was very, very difficult. I had to reconstruct the history of the Sanhedrin in one research. And the conclusion was that we actually don't know enough about this thing known as the Sanhedrin, where it really historically began, though traditionally people say it's the 70 elders mentioned in the book of Numbers, but there really is no evidence that that's really what we're talking about. It's exactly the same thing as the Sanhedrin. And eventually, after digging through different things, I found out that there was a core idea, but the structure that we are aware of today, what we know as the Sanhedrin, is not necessarily what was done historically. So that's some background regarding the Haftarah, which allows me to, unfortunately, have to fill in the material for this reading, because we really only have something in the area of 10 verses. Now, why is it 10 verses? Because there actually is a minimal number of verses you have to read. So from the Torah, if you do the 3.5 year cycle, what they would do is read about 21 verses, more or less, for each person, for the entire reading. So they had 7 people who would read, and each person had to read 3 verses. By the way, that makes life much easier, because instead of having to memorize an entire reading and then read out in public, or memorize 20, 30, 40 verses to be able to read in public, because the Torah scroll has no punctuation, no cantillation, nothing, and no vowel points, you only have to memorize 3 verses, which makes life much, much, much easier. For example, my oldest son had a bar mitzvah. He really only had to read the same verses over and over again, which made the reading much, much easier for him. Unfortunately, he got cold feet just before he was supposed to read, and we ended up having to ask someone to do it for him. But the whole idea is that you have 21 verses, minimal number of 21 verses for a Torah reading. This is from the tractate of Sifrim, which mentions all these rules. And for the Haftarah, it's a minimal number of 10 verses. Now, the issue is that the Haftarah historically, and also the drasha, or the discussion, or the talk that the rabbi gives at the end of the reading, is supposed to be connected somehow to the reading. But because we are in a period where we're actually reading things that were connected to the time and not the reading itself, there's a lot of repetitive material as well. And we end up with having to find sometimes some verses, maybe somewhere, somehow. So I don't really know exactly how, and probably with research I'll probably discover more, I don't know exactly how each one of these 7 readings, the 7 readings of comfort that we have here, were actually selected, but this is a really, really interesting case where we only have 10 verses, and it continues the storyline of the idea. This is chapter 50, Isaiah, chapter 54, verses 1 to 10. And it's a very, very straightforward idea, still talking about Jerusalem as an abandoned wife, as a woman who has no children, and that everything will come back and everything will be great, and really just giving comfort to Jerusalem and making her happy. Now, what's very, very interesting is that this reading parallels 2 other locations in the Bible. The first one is Hosea. Now, there are some interesting links between Hosea and Ishayahu, or Hosea and Isaiah. Very similar names as well. Ishayahu, Yehoshua, Hosea. These are all basically the same name, different variations of the same name. They all still come from the same root, which is Yesha, salvation. And by the way, salvation in the Bible was mostly physical salvation. There's not much discussion about spiritual salvation, though physical salvation is connected to spiritual salvation, because if you are saved physically, it means God has intervened for you as a person, which means your spiritual side is also being elevated. But usually salvation comes with a physical manifestation. So Hosea talks a lot about the idea of the wife and the husband and the betrothal between Israel and God, and returning like a marriage, and that Israel and Judah are not really divorced or anything, and that there will be a covenant, and a long-lasting covenant, and so on. And then we also have some interesting parallels, because he talks about the covenant of David in other places as well. I'm trying to remember if exactly he does the same thing here. Let me look very, very quickly. No, I think it was in the previous reading where he mentions the covenant of David. So there's like a theme that goes on here a little bit in some of the readings, but he does. Some of the commentaries do mention that Psalm 89 has some interesting parallels to this as well, like an everlasting covenant, and that his mercy will never be taken away, and so on. So unfortunately, this is still going to be a relatively short recording, but I really hope you do enjoy it. So we start from verse 1. It says, Roni akara lo yalada, pitzchei rina v'tzali lo chala. So rejoice, a barren woman who has not given birth. So this is a parallel. Akara lo yalada. It's what we call the extended clause parallel, which means that the end of a clause kind of extends the idea of what's being said. So what is a barren woman? A woman who has not given birth. Break out with joy. Roni and Rina are basically the same word. Word comes from the root ranen, to rejoice. So break out with joy. Vetzahali lo chala, and be joyful, she who has not reached the point of birth. The chala here is basically the pains of birth. Ki rabin b'nei shalma mi b'nei ve'ola amar Adonai. For the sons of she who is desolate are greater than, or many in the sense of number, from the sons of she who has been in a be'ula. Really comes from the idea of one who is married and is involved in a sexual act, which really is the origins of the word ba'al. Be'ila has to do with mastery, but having a husband as well. So he says, you are now as if the destruction was so severe, you are as if in a state as if you've never had children and you've never been married. He says you're going to have more children. Your prosperity is going to be greater, and also very surprising. The idea of, I think we mentioned this previously, the idea of the surprise of going into shock, because where do all these children come from? I think this is from the previous reading. So he says to her, so he's talking to Jerusalem, he says, Jerusalem, you have to remember, was the largest city in the area, and eventually did actually grow during the times of King Hezekiah. It had to grow more. So this might be a bit of a hint to that reality, because people were fleeing from the north and they expanded the city. So he says to her, Harchivi mekom aholech, expand the area, the space of your tent. V'yiriot mishkanotai chiatu, and the cloth, the cloth that you of your place of dwelling will be stretched out. Al tahsochi, do not spare it. Let it grow exponentially and just let it just go out there. Ha'arichim et araich, extend your cords, the cords that keep the tent together. Ve'itelotai chazeki, and your pegs strengthen. Make sure they're well placed in the ground. It says, for yemin usmol tifrotzi, for you will expand to the right and to the left. You will burst forth. Now, why do we have this right-left thing? Why doesn't he say north, south, and so on? So, if you think about it, first of all, interesting thing, a little tidbit, the word oriental really comes from to orient yourself. Or really, orient yourself comes from the word oriental. It's the other way around, sorry. To orient yourself comes from the word oriental, which has to do with the idea of the positioning of the person facing east. Because in the mind of people in the ancient world, how do you position yourself? You look east, where the sun rises, because that's where things begin. Your south is to your right. Okay? Your north is to your left. And your west is behind you. This is why you have sometimes yamin usmol, has to do with south and north. By the way, Yemen is called Yemen because of the fact that it's in the south. I think that's the reason why, if I remember correctly. Binyamin. Why is Binyamin called Binyamin? Well, it's also possible, because the name Binyamin, by the way, was a name that was actually common in the ancient Near East, usually was given to people who lived in the southern areas. So the tribe of Binyamin did live south of Israel, so it was very, very appropriate, but that's not the reason it's called Binyamin. And it's very interesting that east is called Kedem, or when you call it to the east, Kedma. Kedem is the front. This is where you stand and look at. Okay? And Kedem and Acho, the back, okay, is really where the west is. Also sometimes west is called Yama, because that's where the ocean is. Okay? But it usually has to do with placing yourself from looking east, and then everything works from there. Today, compasses work on the idea of orienting yourself north, but that's more of a European thing. In the Orient, they basically look to the east. So he says, for you will burst forth to the right and to the left, basically north and south, because to the east and west, there's an idea of expanding to there as well, but you hit the Jordan River and the ocean, but going up and down, or north and south, is much simpler because there's more space to develop into. This, by the way, slightly reminds me of stuff in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel talks about Temple Mount expanding, which means Jerusalem will expand, and so on. And he says, and v'zarech goyim yirash, and your seed, your descendants, your children will inherit the nations. Ve'arim nashamot yoshivu, and empty cities, desolate cities, they will make dwell. They will sit there and make them dwell. It says, Al tiri ki lo tevoshi, not fear, for you will not be ashamed. Ve'al tikalemi ki lo tachpiri, and don't be embarrassed, for you will not be put to shame. It's not an exact translation, but it's the idea of what he's saying. He says, he said to me, because he's relating to negative. So he's saying you won't be like this because this won't happen. This won't be. So he's kind of basically what he's saying here. Maybe there's some translations go a much more precise word, but it's more the issue of identifying what the fact is, what's really being said, and not picking one word versus another word. Though you have to make sure that the translation is correct. It says, Ki voshet alumayach tishkachi, for the shame of your youth you will forget. Vechirpat almanutaich lo tizkiri od, and the shame of your widowness, of being a widow, you will not remember more. But there are actually some places where he does say you will remember, so it's an interesting contradiction. In any case, he says, Ki vo'alayich osayich, for the one who has betrothed you and married you, because Baal has to do with the sexual act, is the one who created you, no more the Assyrians and Babylonians. Adonai Tzevaot Shemo, the Lord of hosts is his name. Ve'go'alech kedosh Yisrael, and your Redeemer. Now, a go'el here is not necessarily from the idea of redeem, salvation and so on, as the way many people today will look at it. A go'el is usually a person who has the right of marriage, the right to salvage property and so on. So he says, your husband is the one who created you. Your Redeemer, your protector, your physical protector is the Holy One of Israel. Elohei chol haaretz yikareh, the God of all the land, he will be named. And eventually, by the way, there are there are some places where God is referred to as the God of everything, the God of heaven and earth, and the Ezra version of the Declaration of Cyrus kind of leads to that direction, which leads to a really interesting discussion about it. Did Cyrus really know the God of Israel? The answer is kind of, which means that he probably had to be made aware of each nation who they believed in. So when he said, "Oh, your God allows it to you," because this was really what the Persians were about. They were against the oppression. They themselves were oppressed. The Medes and the Persians were oppressed by the Assyrians and Babylonians. So they went the exact opposite, and they kind of called freedom for everyone. So a whole historical background to that one as well. It says, it continues, it says, Ki isha azuva ve'atzuvat ruach, for like a woman who is abandoned and is sorrow of spirit, kera'ach Adonai, the Lord has called you, ve'eshet ne'orim ki timayes amar Elohaich, and a wife of youth which has been spurned, says your God. So some people actually say, I think if I remember correctly, that this is actually more of a question saying, you are not going to be like this. Okay? You are actually going to be, are you like this? Are you really a woman who's been abandoned and now is sorrowed? That the Lord has declared you like this? Are you a wife of youth, which is usually the love of your life, which has been spurned, he's been disgusted by her, said your God? He says, no, I've never declared this. This was never the intention. It's really more than a question mark. And he says, no, this is not it. He says, no, this was only a punishment for the time, for the action, for the deed that you did. So he says, I regret pushing you away. And he says, Berer katon azavtich, for a brief moment I abandoned you. A brief moment of anger I abandoned you. This is actually really interesting advice for married couples. For example, men tend to be a bit more aggressive. And the anger is really momentary. You really, a man has to stop and think for a second before he explodes. Stop for a second, think about it. Is it really what you need to do? Is it really worthwhile getting angry over this? And God said it was a moment of anger, and I abandoned you. It says, but with great mercy, with extended, long-lasting mercy, I will gather you. Because you have to remember, it is your wife, it is the person that you love. Is it worthwhile creating damage because of one moment of anger? Is it really? If we say we're made in the image of God, then we're supposed to imitate it. And he says here, I had to make a reaction here, but it was for a moment. And I didn't want it to happen. I didn't want that to be. Is this a complete analogy? Probably not. But it's an interesting idea, I think. It says, "Beshetzef ketzef istarti fanai rega minech," like the foam in the water with shetzef ketzef. So when you usually say like a person foaming in the mouth with a moment of foam in the mouth, a moment of anger, but like the foam of the water that vanishes almost immediately. I hid my face from you for a moment. It says, "Uvechesed olam rechamtich," but with long-lasting mercy, I will show you love. I wish, because the root racham also has to do with love. It's not just to do mercy, it's to show love as well. Amar go'alecha Adonai, said the Redeemer, the Lord. So he says here, this was something momentarily. This was something that I had to do for a moment, but it's not long-lasting. Don't hold the grudge. So then he goes into this really interesting analogy that mentions the waters of Noah. Now there's some differences in versions. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls can have a different version, but the one in the Masoret text is really, really actually very good. It's a much easier version to read, and I think it's much better. Though in academics usually it's the more difficult version that's preferred, but here it really reads very, very well. It says, because there's the motif of water here, the foam and the water of Noah. So he says, Ki me Noah hazotli, for this is like the waters of Noah to me. So he said, I destroyed the world, but I also made an oath. And he says, Asher nishbati, which I vowed, me'avor me Noach od al haaretz, from allowing the waters of Noah from passing on the earth again. He says, I made a promise back then. I made a vow back then that I will never allow the waters of Noah, a flood like that, to reappear again. He says, I'm not going to allow that to happen to you again. You will no longer be destroyed like this again. Now, it's a good question because it did happen again. There have been a lot of destruction and so on. Maybe we haven't seen this yet. Maybe this hasn't happened yet. And in truth, I would say it hasn't, because we haven't seen all the other promises. It says, Ken nishbati mikatzof alayich umigaor bach. Thus I have also vowed from being angry at you, and yelling at you, or being, because it's being angry, that's the katzaf. And then the ge'ara is to yell at someone, is to have an external expression of the anger. Not just being angry from the outside, but from the inside, but also being angry from the outside as well. It says, Ki ha'arim yamushu, for it will be, this is a hypothetical state, the mountains will move away, V'hagevaot temutena, and the hills will collapse. And he says, V'chasdini itech lo yamush, and my mercy to you will not be removed. Uvrit shelomi lo tamot, and my covenant of peace will not collapse. A covenant of peace is a very, very common theme that we find in the ancient Near East in regards to between a king and a servant, a promise of peace, a promise of protection. It says, Amar merachamech Adonai. It says your beloved, your lover, your protector, the Lord. Now, what's very interesting, just to point out something. Previously, we said your husband. We said this earlier, and I'm actually going to make sure I know the exact verse, because I actually am using a version that doesn't have the verses in it, which is really, really interesting. So in verse 5 it says, Ki vo'alayich osayich, for the one who is your husband is also the one who created you. So it's interesting, the term vo'alayich, or vo'alayich, if I remove it from the context, it's vo'alayich. This is actually presented in the plural. And there's a really interesting thing that we do in Hebrew, which is called the honorific plural, from the word honor, or the majestic plural. The same way we do this with the word Elohim. It's not really a plural. It's a plural that's supposed to represent the idea of power, strength, authority, and sometimes absolute authority. And it's used here specifically, and it's a really good opportunity to mention this, because a lot of people ask about the pluralization of some forms, especially the word Elohim. And in truth, the word Elohim is a plural, but it's used in the context when it refers to the God of Israel. It's used more in the context of God having all the power, all the authority, and therefore he is a pluralization. Understand that many gods were manifestations of powers and abilities, and we're saying God of Israel is all in one. We also have to remember that there's forms like El and Eloah and so on, but when we talk about God in overall, we always use the form Elohim, even though it's a plural, but in the context, it's really a singular. So this is what for Israelites, even though morphologically the word Elohim is a plural, for Israelites, Elohim was actually considered to be a singular. So this was a quick opportunity to bring this up. So I actually want to wrap this up because it is not a very, very long reading, and the principles here are very, very straightforward. But it's still interesting to see this theme kind of stretch out, be extended and used over and over again, because really the message during this period of the year is we had 3 destructive situations described, and then suddenly we use an absolute number of 7. Which is a topological number. So it does kind of represent a little bit the idea of, with great mercy and great love and extended love and eternal love, taking a number that represents something much, much bigger. It's bigger than the 3. 3 is an important number, but 7 has a very powerful sense to it, and by that canceling out the 3 bad ones. And there was actually an interesting question just to relate this. Someone asked me, how do you cancel out a curse? And I said, by placing a blessing. We actually have the case of Micha in the book of Judges, or Michaihu, his mother places we understand from his words, his mother places a curse on the one who stole the silver, and he says, you have alit. Alit is to take an oath with a curse, placing a curse on the person who stole. And he says to his mother, you have oathed in a curse formula. So she says at the end, Baruch beni Adonai, my son is blessed to the Lord. Why does she do this? She does it to cancel out her own curse. I think it's the same idea. We read 3 cases of cursing, but then we double up on it. We counter it with 3 good prophecies, and then we double on that with 3 more prophecies, and we take the last one like a cherry on top and place it there and say, and that's the one that seals the entire structure. With those 3 bad prophecies, we've canceled them out by saying 7 good ones. So that's really probably one of the purposes here. Why specifically 7? In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. I apologize it was really short. I couldn't find too many deep things to really dive into, but I really hope you enjoyed this one. Again, remember, share this with your friends. You can share it off of the Facebook page, off of the website. I also have a Twitter account if you do Twitter. And again, as I said, if you want to support this series, HebrewInIsrael.net. The most important thing, first of all, is to listen, to comment, to think, to share, and to expand our knowledge and know better what the text actually says. Kol Tov.